I'm Rosemary Miller. Joining me here today is Kelly Phillips Erb, tax attorney and editor. Thank you so much for joining me, Kelly.
Thank you for having me.
So, Kelly, I've seen shows like The Tinder Swindler, which is basically meeting someone online dating, and then being scammed out of large sums of money. And self admittedly, I have done some online dating myself, and your story has me terrified. So, in your story, you said the Federal Trade Commission says that nearly 70,000 people have been scammed out of money, resulting in roughly what, over $1 billion? And that's only 3% or less of the reported scams. Why do you think this is?
Well, so I think that the reason it doesn't get reported is because it's, I think, embarrassing for a lot of folks to admit that they've been swindled. You mentioned Tinder Swindler, and that was one of the things that when that came out on Netflix, people were talking about how were these women sucked in by this guy? Like, how could that possibly happen? I think people who are targeted in these scams because they're very clearly and professionally done. This is not some random person trying to shake you down for $10. These are actual like crime syndicates that are taking advantage of people. Even though they're really sophisticated schemes, I think people that are impacted by them feel foolish afterwards, and so they don't want to tell anybody because they're worried that somebody will point a finger and say, why didn't you do something differently? So I think that's probably why. I suspect that it's a lot of people who are just kind of looking at what happened to them, looking at what happened to their bank accounts, and just hoping it doesn't happen again.
I could imagine because honestly, when you think about online dating anyway, I feel like we're all a little bit hesitant to say, oh, we met on Tinder, oh, we met on Hinge. So, oh, we met on Hinge, and then I got scammed out of $100,000. I'd be embarrassed too. But I'm interested in knowing who are the common victims here.
So I was really interested when I started researching the story because I will admit that I had a preconceived notion in my head that it was, somebody who was lonely, perhaps not very well educated, maybe with a lot of money, right? But it's actually not the case. The data suggests that people who are targeted tend to be more highly educated. They're not exactly sure why that is. It could be that those are the people who are reporting it, and so maybe there are other people being targeted. But I think it may also be because they are online, right? So if you have some college education or a graduate degree, you might be more likely to be online, so that makes you a target. I think that, again, the data suggests actually that people who make under $100,000 tend to be primary targets. So even though you see, again, Tinder Swindler, those kinds of things where he's targeting people with lots of money, I think scammers tend to target kind of ordinary people who are online, just looking to make a connection. And so they take advantage of that trust.
How are they even doing this? How are they just scamming people? What are some common methods?
So I assumed, again, this is really interesting for me because I assumed it was dating apps, like you mentioned. But actually, most of the connections start through social media, specifically Instagram, which was the number one app, and Facebook. They tend to get folks to move on to other platforms for the chatting, but that's sort of how they start. They see you on Facebook, they make a connection, and in my piece, I actually link to there is a reformed scammer who has worked with Social Catfish, which is a website to kind of help other people identify scammers. And he had a Bible that he actually used and he gave out that told other scammers how to, it's like scripts, right? To tell other scammers how to act. And it was really fascinating because one of the things they do is they mine your social media and they try to find out stuff about you. So maybe they would go to my site and see that I have a dog and I am a tax attorney. So they might message me and say, I see you're a tax attorney. I didn't realize that tax attorneys, were a thing, or I didn't realize that tax attorneys also were writers. So they try to find something out about you that makes them have a conversation with you. And then maybe they bring up the dog, oh, you have a dog. I saw it was a rescue. I love rescues. Tell me more. And so you start kind of getting sucked in, right, to the narrative. And then that's when the asks happen. They'll usually tell you early on that you're not going to meet in real life because of a host of factors. kind of some red flags tend to be they introduce themselves early on as member of the military. That's one of the first that they say, and not just military. Both my brothers are military boys, but they were stationed in the US. Typically, a scammer will tell you that they're military but stationed outside of the country, somewhere where it's difficult to reach so that you can't meet. They'll also often tell you that maybe they're working on an offshore rig or in a foreign country so that they're not going to be able to meet you. They might also say that they're in jail or sick. So they'll tell you kind of up front, like, we can kind of have this online romance, but I'm not going to promise that we're going to meet up, because that kind of starts the relationship off with you understanding that it's not going to happen. And then later it almost, it helps set the stage for why they might ask you for cash. So for example, if they tell you that they're in jail or they're facing charges, then later they might ask you to wire them money for legal costs. Or maybe they tell you that they're sick, and then later they're going to need emergency medical expenses paid. So they try to make a connection based on something that they found out about you, and then they kind of make it about them. How can you help them?
Be careful, you guys. There is a school for scamming out here. Kelly, how would I protect myself against these scammers when they just seem so equipped with all the ways to take my money?
Right. So the funny thing is, when I wrote the story, my daughter, who's in college, she and I were chatting, and I said, "Oh, make sure you check out my story on scammers." And she's like, "Mom, are you telling people how to scam other people?" Because she was looking at it. I'm like, "No. I'm trying to tell people these tactics, because I'm thinking that, if you read about them, if you see how people are operating, then you know exactly how to protect yourself," which is to your question. And so some of the things you can do are, be really wary, right? Anybody who wants to rush into a relationship, you should automatically be a little cautious, because usually relationships, whether online or in real life, take time to develop. If somebody meets you in a day and they start telling you they've fallen in love with you online, and also next week they need money, you should be worried. Don't give out personal information. Again, there's so much information out there already on Facebook, on Instagram, but don't give out extra information. Don't give out bank account information. Don't give out where you work. Don't give out information that could later be used against you if they stole your identity, or that they can use to, ask you for more money. Never give out bank account information and passwords. Again, these seem like things that would be obvious, but when you're in the moment, they're just saying, "I need you to help me out. I have money, but I can't get to it. If you could just loan me this money, and the easiest way for you to do that is just give me your bank account information. I'll make the withdrawal, and then we're good." So be sure not to do that. Another real something that's happening a lot with respect to these scams is cryptocurrency scams that are linked to online dating. And that's where they're asking you to invest in scams. So again, if a relationship invest in crypto, which later becomes a scam. So that's where, if you are asked early on if you're interested in investing, again, another red flag. So I think when you ask it, how can you protect yourself? There are some tips in the story, but I think that, using common sense, like being thoughtful, being cautious, asking professionals. If you have, if somebody says that there's this great investment opportunity and it's called X, and you've never heard of it before, maybe, again, crypto, it's something that you've heard of a little bit and you want to dabble in, but you're not sure, don't ask the online person you've never met. Ask the real life people that you do know. So ask your tax advisor, ask your financial advisor, ask your bank for information, so that you can be equipped to answer these kinds of questions when they come up. Although I will say that the FBI and most other authorities tell you, if someone starts bringing up crypto while you're on your online dating conversations, almost always a scam.
Mm-hmm. And crypto would be rather hard for the FBI to even find that money. They can't locate it, right?
Yeah, well, so this is it's really interesting, because in theory, everything that happens with crypto is on the blockchain, and it's in theory traceable, right? But the reality is that these folks, again, this is not somebody who's taking it, putting it in their wallet and keeping it there. These are folks who are engaged in these crime syndicates. So by the time that you realize it's gone, it's usually pretty hard to trace. And again, most folks, especially if they figured you out, these are not scammers who are going to somebody who is a crypto expert and asking them to invest. They typically are approaching people who might not know anything. And so you might have unwittingly already done a few things to make it hard to claw back. Whereas if you're working through a typical bank or brokerage account, it's a little easier. I mean, that doesn't mean you'll get your money back necessarily, but it's a little easier because there's typically a paper trail. One of the problems, especially with crypto, is that folks may be working out of other countries. And so by the time that the money is gone, it could be in one of many different accounts. It's more difficult to trace.
So switching gears a little bit, how could someone who's been scammed, how could this affect their taxes in some way?
So it used to be before the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in 2016, 2017, it used to be the case that you could deduct these losses from thefts and casualties. They're called casualty theft losses. And if you got scammed, you could basically take a deduction and write it off on your taxes to the extent that you weren't getting insurance money to cover it. In a post-TCJA world, things are a lot different, at least through 2025, and your casualty loss and theft deductions are limited to just those that are in federally declared disaster areas. That being said, there are a couple of situations, especially those involving Ponzi schemes, where there might be breaks available, but they're very limited. So if this kind of thing happens to you, you should definitely report it. But you should also check with your tax advisor and see what options are available to you. Probably limited, but there's an off chance that you might be able to salvage something out of what happened.
So does law enforcement actually do anything about these scams?
So again, one of the really interesting things is a lot of folks aren't reporting them, right? So one of the problems is that if law enforcement doesn't know it's a problem, they can't look for the bad guys. Increasingly, though, they are able to chase down, especially some of these really larger syndicates. And we are seeing some pretty big investigations and arrests related to those things. The Department of Justice actually announced last year 10 defendants that were caught up in these scams. And while some of them were doing traditional types of fraud, like Medicare schemes, Medicaid, COVID relief schemes, there were also folks who had been taken advantage of in these online romance schemes that these defendants had perpetrated. Specifically, there was one gentleman that they mentioned had cheated an elderly woman out of, I think it was $260,000 that he then turned around and used to buy a Ferrari. Fortunately, he was caught, and they are making efforts to step up that enforcement. But again, it kind of all starts with reporting. You can report to local law enforcement, you can report to FBI, you can also report to the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, because the more that they know about these scams, they can also start putting together patterns and hopefully not only apprehend the folks who are responsible, but also put an end to it. In that way, it's sort of like if you remember back when there were a lot of IRS impersonation schemes a few years ago where folks were calling up taxpayers and claiming to be from the IRS and demanding payment over the phone. The more and more of those reports that were made, the more information that the FBI, IRS, CI, and other law enforcement had, and they were actually able to shut down a lot of those call centers. So, we're hopeful that the same kind of thing happens, that more reports mean more information, which means more arrests, which means this becomes less lucrative for folks, and then the scams either stop or they're reduced.
Okay, so that's like the professional answer. Kelly, let's say I'm your sister and they got me. I've been scammed. What would you tell me? What are the ways that I should protect myself?
So I would first absolutely tell you to report it. Even if you were my sister and I wasn't just a lawyer, I would say report it, because again, I think that one of the things that emboldens these scammers is that this is kind of hidden, right? And so they can keep doing the things that they're doing. So even though reporting it might not help you, because maybe they never find that guy who hurt you, maybe it doesn't happen to somebody else. So I would highly encourage you to report it. I would also ask you, what methods were used to take your money. So if you say to me, because there's a few methods that people use, crypto we mentioned, but also wires. That's another way that people pay. Payment apps. People will use like Venmo to send money to a scammer, and also gift cards. Gift cards are actually the most popular, but they're less lucrative than something like crypto, because the average gift card scam only nets about $700, whereas the average crypto scam will net over $10,000. So, it's usually a little more, there's a little more of a reason for a scammer to ask for the crypto. But I would ask you, how did you send the money? And then I would encourage you to report that to the agency. So if it was a bank wire, go to your bank. They might be able to reverse that transaction. Brokerage, same kind of thing. Gift cards a little trickier, because you'd have to figure out, can you cancel them? There are mechanisms for some gift cards, not all, where you can cancel them. Again, we mentioned crypto is a little more difficult, but I would encourage you to go to the the method that you use to send that money, and try to stop it. And if you can't stop it, at least report it. And then I would also encourage you to go to the platform that you used, whether it was Instagram, Facebook, or one of the dating apps, and let them know that it happens, because they might be able to shut down that other profile, assuming they haven't already moved on, shut down that profile, and keep other people safe. And then, the normal things that you would do if somebody had compromised your identity or accounts. If you've given someone your password, make sure you go and change that password. If that's a password you use more than once, make sure you change it across platforms. Make sure that any personal information that you've given, you might want to think about, did I tell them where I bank, and alert your bank, those kinds of things, even if you had not given that an account number to somebody. If you happen to mention that you bank at Wells Fargo, maybe let Wells Fargo know. And then, of course, I would check your credit, just to make sure that nothing shows up on there. I did not mention in the story, but I have had anecdotally, identity thought, I have had anecdotally identity theft fraud, where the person gets information about you and then might open a credit card in your name, that kind of thing. So you just want to make sure that you kind of covered all your bases, so that you protected yourself moving forward.
Thank you so much, Kelly.
Thank you.